My son wrote, "Don't you dare call me anymore. I'm tired of you in my life." I didn't reply a word. I simply canceled all the payments for his rent. A month later, he called me himself. What I did. Good day, dear listeners. It's Louisa again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I used to make his favorite meal every Sunday. Pot roast with carrots and those little pearl onions he'd loved since he was 7 years old. I'd start it Saturday night. Season the meat. Brown it in the cast iron pan. My own mother left me, then let it sit in the oven slow and low until the whole house smelled like something good was coming. Kevin would walk through the door around noon, kick off his shoes in the hallway, and say, "Something smells amazing, Mom." And I'd wave him off like it was nothing, like I hadn't been up since 8, making sure everything was perfect. That was the life I knew for the better part of 40 years. My name is Marjorie Ellen Caldwell, and I am 68 years old. I live in a yellow house outside of Dayton, Ohio, on a street lined with maple trees that go orange and gold every October. My husband Frank passed 11 years ago. Cancer, fast, unkind. And after that, it was just me and the pot roast, and the Sunday visits, and the belief, deep and unexamined, that family was the thing you held on to when everything else went. Kevin was our only child. Frank and I had tried for more, but it didn't happen. And so we put everything into that boy. Every school play, every little league game, every science fair project where I typed his bibliography at midnight because he'd waited too long. I'm not saying I was a saint. I made mistakes. But I loved that boy with every cell in my body, and for most of his life I believed he loved me back. He met Tiffany when he was 34. She was younger, 30, with straight blonde hair and a way of smiling that never quite reached her eyes. I tried not to notice that. I told myself I was being an unfair mother-in-law, one of those women I'd always pitied and vowed never to become. So I was careful. I bought her birthday gifts. I asked about her sister's wedding. I made sure the guest room had good towels when they visited. But things shifted slowly, the way water carves a canyon. You don't see it happening until the landscape has already changed. The Sunday visits became every other Sunday, then once a month. Then, "We're really busy, Mom. We'll try to make it next week." The phone calls got shorter. Kevin started texting instead of calling, and the texts got further apart. I told myself it was just life. They were busy, they had careers, they had friends their own age. I told myself that was normal. What wasn't normal was what I was paying for. Let me back up. When Kevin and Tiffany got married, they moved into an apartment in Columbus. A nice one, 2 bedrooms, granite countertops, one of those buildings with a gym and a rooftop terrace. Kevin was working in sales at the time, and Tiffany had just switched jobs. They were a little stretched. Kevin called me, not texted, called, and asked if I could help with rent for a few months, just until they got on their feet. It was $1,650 a month. I said yes. Of course I said yes. He was my son. That was 6 years ago. The few months became a year. The year became 2. I brought it up, gently, once, and Kevin said they were still rebuilding their savings after some unexpected car repairs and Tiffany's dental bills. He sounded tired and a little ashamed, so I let it go. Another year passed, then another. By the time Kevin sent me that message, I had paid 81 months of rent. I had given that apartment, and by extension, my son and his wife, just over $133,000. I didn't know that number yet on the morning I read his text. I was sitting at my kitchen table with my coffee, still in my robe, watching the birds at the feeder Frank had built the summer before he got sick. It was a Tuesday in March. Nothing about it felt like the kind of morning your life changes. My phone buzzed. Kevin's name lit up the screen. I opened it expecting, what? A question about Easter dinner, a photo, something normal. Instead, I read, "Don't ever call me again. I am tired of having you in my life." I read it 3 times. Then I set the phone face down on the table and looked out at the birds. The cardinal was there, the one that came every morning. Frank always said cardinals were visits from people you'd lost. I watched it for a long time. I didn't cry right away. I didn't respond. I just sat there in my yellow kitchen in my robe, holding my coffee cup with both hands, feeling the heat go out of it, while something else, something I couldn't name yet, began, very quietly, to go cold inside me. I didn't eat that day. I'm not sure I moved from that chair for the better part of 2 hours. The birds came and went. A neighbor walked her dog past the window. The world outside kept its schedule, indifferent and ordinary, while I sat inside mine, trying to understand what had just happened. Had I done something? I turned the last weeks over in my mind, the way you worry a loose tooth, carefully, compulsively. Our last phone call had been 2 Sundays before, and it had seemed fine. Kevin mentioned he and Tiffany were looking at new furniture for the living room. I asked about his job. He said things were good. He said, "I'll call you next week, Mom." He hadn't. But that wasn't unusual anymore. The week before that, a text. A photo of their dog, Biscuit, a golden retriever I'd met exactly twice, wearing a little Halloween bandana even though it was March. I'd written back, "Biscuit is adorable. Miss you both." Kevin had replied with a thumbs up emoji. A thumbs up emoji. Was that the last real communication? A thumbs up? I made myself get up and shower. I made myself eat half a piece of toast. And then I sat back down at the table with a legal pad. Frank's old habit, I'd inherited it. And I started writing things down. Not because I had a plan yet, because I needed to see the shape of what I was dealing with. At the top of the page, I wrote, "What do I actually know?" I knew Kevin had a wife who didn't like me. I'd suspected that for years without letting myself say it plainly. I knew the visits had stopped. I knew I was paying $1,650 a month for their apartment. And I knew my son had just told me, in capital letters, that he was tired of having me in his life. I turned to a clean page. I wrote, "How long have I been paying rent?" I went back through my bank records. I use online banking. Frank made me learn it before he passed, bless him. And I started counting. The first transfer was dated September, 4 years before last, and they'd been monthly since. I found the earliest and counted forward. 81 payments, $1,650 each. I wrote the number at the bottom of the column and stared at it. $133,650. My hands felt strange. Not shaky, more like hollow, like the bones had been removed. That wasn't grocery money. That wasn't a birthday gift. That was nearly my entire savings outside of Frank's pension and the equity in this house. I had given it slowly, month by month, the way you don't notice a leak until you check the basement and find the water up to your knees. And now, my son had told me not to contact him, in capital letters. I thought about calling my friend Dorothy. We've been friends since Kevin was in diapers. She lives 3 streets over. But I stopped myself. I wasn't ready to say it out loud yet. Saying it out loud would make it fully real, and I needed to think first. Here is what I was afraid of, and I'm not ashamed to admit it. I was afraid I had done something wrong without knowing it. I was afraid that maybe Tiffany had a legitimate grievance I was unaware of, that maybe I'd said something at Christmas 3 years ago, or that Kevin had finally admitted to her that he felt smothered. Mothers can smother. I knew that. I did not believe I was that kind of mother, but what if I was wrong? I sat with that fear for most of the afternoon. And then, somewhere around 4 o'clock, with the light going golden through the kitchen window, a different thought arrived. Even if I had done something wrong, even if I had committed some offense I was unaware of, did that warrant $133,650? Was that the price of whatever my sin was? I tore off the page with the number and looked at it for a long time. Then I folded it carefully and put it in the front pocket of my purse, where I keep things I need to remember. I wasn't angry yet. Anger would come later. What I felt in that moment was something quieter and more deliberate. Clarity. The kind that comes when you stop trying to make something make sense and start dealing with what's actually in front of you. I opened my bank's website. I navigated to the recurring payment I had set up 6 years ago, $1,650 monthly, to the account Kevin had given me. I looked at the cancel button for a long time. Then I clicked it. I confirmed the cancellation. I watched the screen update. No dramatic music, no thunder. Just a small white confirmation notice on a blue screen. Recurring payment canceled. I closed the laptop and went to put the kettle on. I had no idea what would happen next. I had no plan beyond that one action. But I had stopped the bleeding, and that felt, for the first time all day, like the right thing to do. More than right. Necessary. The kettle whistled. I made my tea. Outside, the cardinal was back at the feeder. What would Frank have done? I asked myself that. He would have done exactly what I just did, I decided, and then he would have talked to a lawyer. Frank was practical that way. He always said, "When in doubt, find someone who knows more than you do." I picked up my phone and called my attorney, Martin Schreiber. We'd worked together years ago on Frank's estate. I left him a message asking if he had time to meet that week. That was my first step. Quiet, deliberate, and entirely irreversible. Martin Schreiber had been Frank's lawyer before he was mine, and he had one of those faces that made you feel like whatever problem you'd walked in with was manageable. Not dismissible. He took things seriously. But manageable. He had an office downtown in a building that smelled like old carpet and coffee. And when I sat down across from him that Thursday morning, he listened to the whole story without interrupting once. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Marjorie, do you have documentation of all these transfers?" "I have 6 years of bank records," I said. "I printed them last night." I slid the folder across his desk. He opened it. He turned pages slowly. "No written agreement?" he asked. "No loan documents? No emails where Kevin acknowledged this was anything other than a gift?" "No," I said. "He called me. It was always a phone call." Martin nodded, still reading. "What about texts?" That gave me pause. I had saved texts for years. Not intentionally. I'd just never deleted them. I was that person. I told Martin, and he said I should go through them carefully and look for any message where Kevin referred to the payments in any context, even casually. Any acknowledgement in writing that the money existed and what it was for. "I can't promise it changes your legal position," he said carefully. "Money transferred to an adult child without a written agreement is generally presumed to be a gift under Ohio law. Recovering it is difficult." "I don't care about recovering it," I said. He looked up. "I just needed to understand what I was dealing with," I told him. "I needed someone else to look at it and tell me I wasn't crazy." He put the folder down. "You are not crazy," he said. "This is a significant financial loss, and the circumstances you're describing, the escalating distance, the sudden hostile message after 6 years of payments, raise real questions about what was happening in that household." I drove home with a cleaner feeling in my chest. That night, I went through every text conversation with Kevin, going back 4 years. The oldest ones my phone still held. Most were brief. Weather, holidays, the dog. But I found 3 messages that stopped me. The first was from 2 years ago, November. Kevin had texted, "Thanks for the rent this month. Things are still tight, but we're working on it." Simple. Throwaway. But it was an acknowledgement in writing that he knew about the payments and that they were ongoing. The second was 14 months ago. He'd written, "Hey, Mom, can you do $1,800 this month instead? Landlord raised it, I'll explain later." I had replied, "Of course, no problem." And I had increased the transfer. I sat with that one for a long time. He had asked for more, and I had given it without question. The third message was 8 months ago. This one made my jaw tighten. It was Tiffany. She'd used Kevin's phone, I could tell by the writing style. She'd texted, "Hi, Marjorie. Kevin's at work. Just wanted to say the place is really coming together. We got those new couches we've been looking at." New couches, while I was paying their rent. While my grocery budget had been quietly shrinking for 2 years because of a few months of financial help. I photographed all 3 messages. I emailed them to Martin. Then I sat back and thought about what was actually happening in that apartment in Columbus. Was Kevin aware that I had canceled the payment? Not yet. The next payment date was still 12 days away. He had no idea anything had changed. He had presumably told me never to call him again, blocked any response from me, and was sitting in his apartment, on his new couches, fully expecting that $1,800 to land in their account in less than 2 weeks. Did Tiffany know about the message he'd sent me? Almost certainly. Those two were a unit. And here was the question that unsettled me most. Lying in bed that night, with the house very quiet around me. Had she written it for him? The capitalization, the directness, the finality? It hadn't sounded entirely like Kevin. Kevin was passive in his cruelty. He didn't confront. He withdrew. But that message had been a door slammed, not a door quietly closed. I didn't sleep well. But when I woke up at 6, something had crystallized. I called my niece, Patricia, Frank's sister's daughter, who works in banking in Cincinnati. Not to ask for help, not yet, but to ask her a question. I said, "Patricia, if someone has been receiving money from a family member for 6 years and calls it rent help, does that ever appear on financial documents? Mortgage applications, loan applications, anything like that?" Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Marjorie, are you asking me what I think you're asking me?" "I'm asking a hypothetical." Another pause. "Hypothetically," she said, "if a person was listing their income on a loan application and had been receiving regular monthly transfers for years, the absence of those transfers, suddenly, right before an application went in, could complicate things significantly." I thanked her and hung up. I didn't know if Kevin and Tiffany were in the middle of anything financial, but I had a feeling, the kind that starts in your spine and works outward, that they might be. The new furniture, the mention, last fall, of looking at houses in a good school district, the quiet that had preceded that message. They had been planning something that required me to be a reliable source of income and nothing else. I was beginning to understand the shape of it. The first payment date came and went. No deposit. No $1,800 arriving in Kevin's account on the 15th of the month, the way it had for 81 consecutive months. I sat at my kitchen table and watched the date pass, the way you watch a storm move across a field. At a distance, with full attention. I had expected the phone to ring that day. It didn't. I had expected it the next day. Still nothing. By the third day, I started to wonder if perhaps I'd been wrong about everything, about Tiffany's calculations, about the house search, about all of it. Maybe Kevin genuinely didn't want my money anymore. Maybe his message had been the beginning of a clean break, financial and otherwise. Maybe the silence was him saying, "We're done. We don't need you. On the fourth day, at 7:20 in the evening, my phone rang. Kevin's name on the screen. I let it ring 4 times. Then I answered. Mom. His voice was different from how I remembered it. Tighter. I need to talk to you. Hello, Kevin, I said. The rent payment didn't come through. I know. Silence. Then, there must have been some kind of bank error. Can you look into it? I had prepared for this. I'd said the words to myself in the bathroom mirror the morning before, which made me feel slightly ridiculous, but it had helped. There's no bank error, I said. I canceled the payment. Another silence. Longer. You canceled it, he repeated. Yes. After everything, after... He stopped. Started again. Mom, we're in the middle of something. This is not a good time for this. Kevin, I said, you told me not to call you again. You told me you were tired of having me in your life. I didn't call you. You called me. I heard him exhale. I heard in the background Tiffany's voice, low and urgent, saying something I couldn't make out. That was a moment, Kevin said. I was frustrated. You know how I get. I do know, I said. Yes. So you'll set the payment back up. It wasn't a question. That was the thing that cut through whatever remaining maternal softness I'd been holding. He hadn't said, I'm sorry, Mom. He hadn't said, I miss you. He'd called to restore service. I was a utility to him. I was the internet going out. I won't, I said. I wish you both well. I hung up. The phone rang again immediately. I didn't answer. It rang 6 more times over the next 2 hours. I sat on the couch with a cup of chamomile tea and my library book, and I let it ring. Then the texts started. Kevin. Mom, pick up. Kevin. This is serious. We need to talk. Kevin. You have no idea what you're doing. And then, the one that wasn't Kevin's voice at all. Marjorie. This is Tiffany. What you're doing is cruel and manipulative. Kevin has been under enormous stress, and you pulling this stunt right now is going to have consequences. I suggest you think very carefully. I read that one 3 times. Consequences. I photographed the screen. I emailed it to Martin that night. The next morning, it escalated. Kevin called again, and when I answered, I wanted to hear what they'd say next. He was different. The tight politeness was gone. He told me that if I didn't restore the payment, he would talk to people about what I'd done over the years. I asked him, calmly, what exactly he meant. He said that I had interfered in their marriage, that I had inserted myself into their finances as a form of control, and that he could make that case to a family court if it ever came to it. Family court. Over rent I had voluntarily given him. I said, Kevin, I'd encourage you to discuss that plan with an attorney before you pursue it. He hung up. That afternoon, Martin called me after receiving my forwarded texts. He told me that Tiffany's message, specifically the word consequences alongside a demand for money, could be interpreted as a form of financial coercion, and that I should continue to document everything. I told him I was. Are you all right? Martin asked. I'm tired, I said honestly. But I'm all right. I spent the next 3 days doing very little. I went to Dorothy's house and sat in her kitchen while she made soup. I walked the neighborhood in the evenings. I slept later than usual, which I never do. I needed the quiet. I needed to let my nervous system understand that what had happened had not killed me, that the earthquake I'd been afraid of for years had finally hit, and I was still standing in my yellow house on my maple-lined street. On the 3rd evening, sitting in Dorothy's kitchen with a bowl of minestrone, I told her the whole story, beginning to end. She listened. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, she put her hand over mine and said, Marjorie, I always wondered when you were going to see this clearly. You knew I asked. I suspected, she said, but it wasn't my place. We sat there for a while in the warm kitchen while the soup pot ticked on the stove. What are you going to do? She asked. I already did it, I said. They tried the soft approach next. 11 days after my last exchange with Kevin, 11 days of silence. I received a text that was so carefully worded I could almost see Tiffany drafting it, deleting, redrafting. It came from Kevin's number. Mom, I've been thinking. I know things have been hard between us. I don't want it to be like this. Can we maybe meet for coffee? I read it at my kitchen table with my morning coffee. Same chair, same birds at the feeder. The cardinal was there. Here's what I noticed. He had not apologized. He had not mentioned the original message, the don't ever call me again, not to withdraw it, not to explain it, not to acknowledge it existed. He had also not mentioned the rent. The text was written as though we'd had a small disagreement about something minor, the kind of thing you smooth over with a cup of coffee. What Kevin did not know, what neither of them knew, was that in those 11 days, while I'd been quiet and appeared to be waiting, I had not been idle. I had met with Martin twice more. I had pulled together a full financial accounting of everything I'd paid over 6 years. The original $1,650, the increase to $1,800 14 months ago, the occasional additional amounts when Kevin had mentioned unexpected expenses, a total of $138,200 when calculated precisely. Martin had helped me draft a simple personal record document, notarized, stating the history of the payments, their voluntary nature, and the dates of the communications I'd received. I wasn't pursuing legal action. Martin had been clear, and I understood, that voluntarily given money to an adult child without a contract was nearly impossible to recover under Ohio law. That wasn't the point. The point was documentation. The point was knowing exactly what had happened, in ink, with a notary's stamp, in case it ever needed to be known by someone else. Martin had also, at my request, sent a brief formal letter to Kevin, not threatening, purely informational, stating that I had retained counsel and that any future communications regarding financial matters should go through his office. Not a lawsuit, not an accusation, just a line drawn clearly in the open air. That letter had arrived at Kevin's address 4 days before his coffee invitation, which is why the coffee invitation did not move me. I wrote back, Kevin, I hope you're well. I'm not in a position to meet right now. Take care of yourself. Short. Warm enough not to be cruel. Final. He tried twice more in the following week, once with a longer message about how he'd been under stress at work, how Tiffany had been struggling emotionally, how he regretted things but needed me to understand his side. Once with a photo of Biscuit, the golden retriever, lying on a couch with soft light coming in through a window. Thought you'd like this, he wrote, with no other context. The dog photo almost worked. I won't pretend otherwise. There's a specific kind of pull when someone uses something innocent and sweet to reach you. For about 4 minutes, I sat there thinking about how much I had always wanted a dog, how Frank had been allergic, how Kevin had grown up wanting one too. Then I thought about $138,200. I put the phone down. What had helped me most in those weeks, more than Martin, more than my own resolve, was a grief support group that met on Wednesday evenings at the community center on Elm Street. I'd started going 8 months earlier, originally because of a difficult anniversary of Frank's death, and I'd kept going because the people there were real. Retired teachers, widows, a man named Gerald who'd lost his daughter to addiction, people who had survived loss and were figuring out how to carry it. I told them what had happened, not everything, not the money, just, my son told me he was tired of having me in his life. And the room got very quiet. Gerald said, "Did he mean it, or was he testing you?" I don't know, I said, but I've decided to let him mean it. The woman next to me, Vera, 72, a retired piano teacher, put her hand on my arm. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Walking to my car afterward, with the night air cool and the parking lot half lit, I realized something. I was not alone. I had Dorothy and Martin and Gerald and Vera and this small circle of honest people. I had Frank's memory, which was a kind of company all its own. What I did not have was anxiety. That was the thing that surprised me most in those weeks. I had expected to feel afraid of Kevin's anger, of the estrangement becoming permanent, of waking up at 75 with no son. And I did feel those things, in quiet, passing waves. But underneath them was something I hadn't felt in a long time. Steadiness. My own steadiness. The kind that comes not from being certain everything will turn out right, but from knowing you made the right choice. I paid my own rent that month, my own bills. I bought a small orchid for the kitchen windowsill. I slept well. They came to the house on a Saturday. I hadn't been warned. I was in the backyard pulling dead stems out of the garden bed when I heard a car in the driveway. By the time I'd walked around to the front, Kevin was already standing on the porch, his hands in his jacket pockets, and Tiffany was coming up the front walk behind him. She was carrying a dish, something covered in foil. I stopped on the path. The last time I'd seen Kevin in person was 7 months ago at a brief, stiff lunch in Columbus that Tiffany had cut short, claiming a headache. Before that, Christmas. I took in the sight of him. He looked thinner, or maybe just tired, with shadows under his eyes. Tiffany looked the way she always looked, put together, neutral, unreadable. "Mom," Kevin said, "we were in the area. Thought we'd stop by. Dayton to my house is 90 minutes from Columbus. Nobody is in the area." "All right," I said. I opened the door and let them in. In my kitchen, Tiffany set the foil dish on the counter. "A casserole," she explained. She'd made it herself. She was very pleasant saying this. A deliberate, careful pleasantness that I recognized from her best performances at family holidays. Kevin sat at the table. He looked around the kitchen the way people do when they're building up to something. I made coffee. I let them settle. I waited. Kevin spoke first. He said he'd been doing a lot of thinking. He said he missed me. He said the things he'd written in that message had been said in a moment of anger and exhaustion, and he wasn't proud of them. He said quietly that Tiffany had helped him understand that he needed to work on communication. I noticed he still hadn't said the word sorry. Tiffany took over smoothly, the way a relay runner grabs a baton. She said she knew things had been difficult. She said she'd always admired me and wanted a real relationship. She said, looking at me very directly, with those eyes that had never quite smiled, that she hoped we could all move forward as a family. I sipped my coffee. "What does moving forward look like?" I asked. Kevin shifted in his chair. Tiffany's expression didn't change. "We were thinking," Kevin said, "that maybe we could reset things, start fresh, the three of us. Regular dinners, Sunday visits, the whole thing." "That sounds nice," I said. Kevin visibly relaxed. Tiffany's posture eased slightly. "And obviously," Kevin said, more carefully, "with things back to normal, the financial arrangement could go back to what it was." There it was. I set my cup down. I looked at him. I thought, there it is. The foil dish on the counter. The mention of missing me. The "we were in the area." The entire architecture of this visit. "Kevin," I said, "I love you. I want you to know that hasn't changed, but I won't be resuming the payments." The room changed. It was subtle. The air pressure shifted. "Mom, I paid your rent for 6 years," I said. $138,000. I did that because I loved you and I believed you needed it. I don't regret it. But it's done now. Tiffany's pleasantness dissolved, not dramatically. She didn't raise her voice. But the warmth vacated her face like a light going out, and what was underneath it was something I can only describe as calculation. Marjorie, she said, I think you're letting hurt feelings make a financial decision that affects all of us. I think that's accurate, I said. Yes. You're punishing Kevin, she said. After everything we've been through together as a family, you're choosing money over your relationship with your son. Tiffany, I said, I didn't make any demands. I didn't ask for anything to change. Kevin sent me a message telling me never to contact him again. I respected that. You are both here, in my kitchen, because you want the payments restored. That's not me putting money over family. That's me declining to fund a family that has no room for me in it. Kevin stood up. His jaw was tight. You're making a mistake, he said. You don't know everything that's going on. Then tell me, I said. Tell me what's going on. He didn't. He looked at Tiffany. She looked back at him. Some communication passed between them that excluded me entirely, and I saw, in that quick, shut glance, the whole shape of what I'd been living inside for years. I was not part of their unit. I was adjacent to it. A resource. We should go, Tiffany said. She picked up her purse. Kevin followed her. At the door, he turned back and said, and this was the thing that stayed with me. Don't come looking for us when you're lonely, Mom. That's all I'm going to say. The door closed. I stood in my kitchen for a long moment. My hands were trembling slightly, and I wasn't sure whether it was anger or something older and sadder. I looked at the casserole dish, still on my counter, still foil-covered, and I put it straight in the trash without opening it. I was afraid. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't. The permanence of it had pressed itself against me. The real possibility that I would grow old without my son. That I would have Christmases alone and no one to call when I couldn't open a jar. But here is what the fear did. It made me more certain. Because I understood that if I capitulated now, if I reopened the payments out of loneliness or guilt or the wish to make the fear stop, I would be back here in 2 years, in 3, in 5. I would be 75 or 80 with fewer resources and the same dynamic, only worse. The fear was real, and the fear was pointing at the truth. I called Dorothy. They came, I said. I figured it was soon, she said. Are you all right? I'm all right, I said. I just needed to say it to someone. The mortgage application came to light 3 weeks later. I wouldn't have known about it at all if Patricia hadn't called me. My niece, Frank's sister's daughter, the one in banking in Cincinnati. She called on a Tuesday evening, and her voice had that particular careful quality that means someone is choosing their words in real time. She said, Marjorie, I want to be careful about what I tell you, because some of this touches on professional matters, but I think you need to know something. What she told me, slowly and with appropriate disclaimers, was this. Kevin and Tiffany had submitted a mortgage application on a house, a 4-bedroom in a suburb of Columbus with good school ratings, approximately 8 weeks before Kevin had sent me that message. The application had included, in their income documentation, a record of regular monthly transfers from my account to theirs, going back 3 years, not as loan repayments, listed as consistent family income supplement. The application had been moving through processing, and then, on the month my payments stopped, it had stalled. Patricia didn't know all the details. She was being careful not to share anything she shouldn't. But she knew enough, and she cared enough about me to make the call. I thanked her, and sat for a long time with the phone in my lap. So that was the shape of it, seen whole at last. Kevin and Tiffany had been using my consistent payments as a documented income source on a mortgage application. When I canceled, when the money stopped arriving on the 15th, the application had run into trouble. The school district remark from last fall, the new furniture, the sudden need for things to be normal between us, it assembled itself into a timeline I could read clearly now. The message, "Don't ever call me again," had been sent 8 weeks into the mortgage process. A clean break, perhaps intended to be temporary. Perhaps they thought they'd close on the house, then mend fences with me once they no longer needed the income on paper. Or perhaps they'd simply miscalculated, assumed I would keep paying out of habit and love regardless of their silence. I would never know which. What I knew was this: it wasn't grief that had sent that message. It wasn't years of frustration or a genuine need for distance. It was a transaction. I had been managed. I brought all of this to Martin the next morning, including Patricia's account. Martin was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then he said, "Marjorie, are you aware that submitting false income documentation on a mortgage application is a federal offense?" "I'm aware," I said. "Do you want to do anything with this information?" I had thought about this the night before, lying awake in the dark. I had gone back and forth. What I had settled on was not revenge, not in the way that word usually means. It was something closer to accountability. "I want Kevin to know that I know," I said. "Nothing more than that. No lawyers, no reports, not yet. I want to look him in the eye, and I want him to understand that I'm not the person he thought I was." Martin helped me draft a letter. Not threatening, not accusatory in legal terms. Simply factual. I have become aware, through reliable means, of certain documentation submitted in connection with a recent financial application. I believe you should know this information has come to my attention. I wish to meet and speak with you once, in person, in the presence of my attorney. We sent it certified mail. Kevin called me the same day it arrived. His voice, this time, was entirely different from any version I'd heard before. Not the fake warmth of the kitchen visit, not the tight control of the rent call. Something stripped back. Something that sounded, honestly, like a young man who understood that something had caught up with him. "Mom," he said, "what is this?" "It's a letter," I said. "I think it's quite clear." "Who told you? How did you—" "Kevin," I said. "I'd like us to meet. In Martin's office, as the letter says. I'd like Tiffany to be there as well." Silence. "I'm not trying to destroy you," I said, and I meant it. "I am not calling a federal agency. I am not contacting the mortgage company. I just need you to sit across from me, in a room, and be honest with me. For once." He came. 3 days later, a Thursday, a gray November morning. He and Tiffany sat on one side of Martin's conference table. Martin and I sat on the other. Tiffany had clearly been crying recently. Her face had that tight, overcomposed quality of someone who has been crying and then carefully repaired. Kevin had aged in those 3 days in some way I couldn't entirely quantify. I had notes on the table in front of me. I didn't use them. I said, "I want to tell you what I know, and I want you to let me finish." They both nodded. I went through it. The message, the payments, the timeline, the mortgage application, Patricia's call. I said it all calmly, without raising my voice once, looking at my son the whole time. Not at Tiffany, at Kevin. He was the one I needed to reach. When I finished, the room was very quiet. Tiffany began first. She said the transfers had been listed as family support income, which she claimed was a standard documentation category. She said she'd consulted with their application broker about it. She said a lot of words, and underneath all of them, I heard, "We found a technicality, and we used it." Martin looked at her without expression. Then Kevin said something I hadn't expected. His voice was quiet. He said, "Mom, I know what it looked like. And I know you're not. I know you're not wrong." Tiffany turned to look at him. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on me. "Was any part of it real?" I asked. I had promised myself I would ask exactly that question if I got the chance. "The Sunday visits, the pot roast, any of it." He didn't answer right away. His jaw moved. His eyes went wet. Not dramatically, just a slight gleam. "Yes," he said. "At the beginning. Before." Before what? I didn't ask. I understood. Before Tiffany, or before whatever version of himself he'd become inside that marriage. Some combination that I wasn't equipped to fully unravel. "Then I'm grieving something real," I said. "And so should you." The mortgage application was withdrawn 2 weeks after our meeting in Martin's office. I don't know who made the decision, Kevin or Tiffany, or the two of them together at their kitchen table in Columbus on some evening I can't picture. The house in the good school district went to someone else. I know this because Patricia told me, carefully, that the file had been closed. I did not report anything. I did not contact the mortgage company or any federal agency. Not because I had been lenient or soft. Martin and I had discussed it thoroughly. But because I had achieved what I needed to achieve. I had made Kevin understand that I knew. I had made both of them sit across from me in a room and be unable to pretend. In some forms of reckoning, exposure is sufficient. But other things followed, and they followed on their own. 2 months after the meeting, Kevin called me. Not for money. Not to make arrangements. He called at 7 in the evening, and he sounded the way he used to sound when he was younger, and something was wrong, and he needed his mother without knowing how to ask for it. He said he and Tiffany were having some difficulties. He didn't say more than that, and I didn't press. "I hear you," I said. "I'm sorry, Mom." And this time, there it was. The word, undecorated, unstrategic. For the message. For all of it. "I know that doesn't—" He stopped. Started again. "I know that doesn't fix anything." "No," I agreed. "It doesn't fix it. But it's still good to hear." We talked for 40 minutes. It wasn't the conversation that would repair everything. I knew that. Repair, if it came, would come slowly and in pieces. But it was a beginning of something, and it was real. What I had control over, I took control of. What I didn't, I let be. The financial picture also resolved in ways I hadn't expected. After canceling the recurring payment, I'd begun reviewing my accounts more carefully, something I'd been loose about for years, assuming everything was fine and keeping my attention on Kevin's needs instead of my own. What I found, working with Martin and a financial advisor he recommended, was that I was in better shape than I'd feared. Frank's pension was stable. The house was paid off. I had a modest but real investment account I'd barely touched in a decade. I was not wealthy, but I was solvent. I was fine. I made some changes. I set up a small automatic transfer to a travel fund, something I hadn't done since Frank passed. I signed up for a watercolor class at the community center, something I'd thought about for 15 years and always postponed because there was always something else. I went to Dorothy's for dinner every Friday. I kept going to the Wednesday evening group, and I did the thing I'd always wanted. In the spring, April, when the maples were just starting to go green again, I adopted a dog, a beagle mix, 7 years old, from the county shelter. His name was already Walter, and it suited him so completely that I kept it. Walter had brown eyes and enormous ears, and he slept on the foot of my bed and walked with me every morning around the block. Frank would have found a way around his allergies. I knew that the moment I put Walter in the car and he put his head out the window. As for Tiffany, what I learned in the months that followed came to me in fragments, not all at once, and not because I sought it out. From Kevin, eventually, from Patricia once or twice. Tiffany had, it turned out, pushed for the house. Had pushed hard. The mortgage application had been her initiative, and the documentation strategy, listing my transfers as income, had been something she'd discussed with a broker on the edge of legitimacy. When the application fell apart, things between them had deteriorated in ways I wasn't told the details of. I didn't feel satisfaction at that. I want to be honest about that. I felt something more complicated, a sadness for my son, who had made choices that had cost him, and something quieter underneath it, which was, this is what accountability looks like. Not dramatic, not punishing, just consequences arriving in their own time, at their own pace, in their own form. Martin sent me a note 2 months after the meeting. It said simply, "Well handled, Marjorie. Frank would be proud." I put it in the front pocket of my purse, next to the folded piece of paper where I'd first written down $133,650. I kept both of them there for a long time. Spring became summer, and summer passed gently. I started the watercolor class and discovered, to my genuine surprise, that I had some aptitude for it. Not brilliance, I wasn't going to have a gallery show, but something real. My instructor, a soft-spoken man named Hugh, who had studied in Vermont, told me I had a good instinct for color and restraint, which felt like the best compliment I'd received in years. We painted landscapes mostly, the creek behind the community center, the grain elevator on the edge of town, the maples on my street in their October peak. I gave Dorothy the maple painting for her birthday. She cried. Walter became the organizing principle of my mornings in the best possible way. Up at 6:30, out the door, around the block, and then to the park 3 streets over, where the other dog people gathered without formal arrangement, drawn by routine and the common language of leashes and mud. I knew their dogs before I knew their names. The small poodle named Clementine, the enormous brindle thing called Hank, the ancient basset hound whose name I never caught because his owner always called him, "You ridiculous creature." I became a regular. I became known. It was a small life in some respects, but it was fully mine, and I had forgotten, somewhere in the years of Frank's illness and its aftermath and the slow project of Kevin's dependence, what it felt like to inhabit my own days with that kind of ease. Dorothy and I took a trip in July. We'd been talking about Savannah for years. She had family there. And we finally just booked it. 5 days, a bed and breakfast in the historic district, walking tours, restaurants we couldn't afford in our regular lives, but could afford for 5 days if we were careful. I drank sweet tea on a wrought iron balcony and watched the Spanish moss move in the evening breeze and felt, with unexpected force, that I was lucky. Specifically, concretely lucky. Not in an abstract gratitude journal way. Lucky in the sense of having been given more than I'd earned. Kevin and I had found a kind of careful equilibrium by then. He called on Sunday evenings, which he'd started doing sometime in June, and the calls were 20 or 30 minutes. Nothing strained, nothing forced. We talked about Walter, mostly. Kevin had always wanted a dog, and Walter was a reliable neutral topic that slowly became something warmer. In August, Kevin came to Dayton alone for a day. We had lunch at the diner on 5th Street, where Frank and I used to go on Saturday mornings. We didn't talk about the money or the mortgage or the message. We talked about a book he was reading and the drought that had hit Ohio that summer and the fact that he'd started running, which surprised us both. He hugged me at the car when he left. I didn't make a thing of it, but I held it close afterward, the way you hold something that might be breakable. I did not ask about Tiffany, and he didn't offer. I understood she was no longer in the apartment in Columbus, but the details were not mine to know. What I understood, from the little Kevin said, and the spaces around it, was that the weight of the past year had come down on her in particular ways. The mortgage failure had strained them. The meeting in Martin's office had changed something she hadn't expected to be changed. She was a woman who was very good at managing appearances, and what had happened in that conference room, being seen clearly, in full light, without the protection of the performance, had apparently been something she couldn't recover from quickly. I don't say this with pleasure. I say it as a fact I observed from a distance. I saw her once, by coincidence, in November. I was in Columbus for Patricia's daughter's birthday party, and I stopped at a grocery store on the way. Tiffany was in the bread aisle. She saw me at the same moment I saw her. We both stopped. She looked tired, not beaten. Tiffany was not the kind of person who would let you see beaten, but tired in the way that comes when the architecture you've built your life around has required too much maintenance. I said, "Hello, Tiffany." She said, "Marjorie." Neither of us moved for a moment. Then I said, "I hope things are going better for you." And I meant it. I genuinely meant it. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't read. "Take care of yourself," she said. We went in opposite directions down the aisle. I thought about that exchange all the way home to Dayton, Walter asleep across my lap, the November fields dark outside the car window. I thought about what it would have felt like, a year earlier, to see her and feel the complex terror of her, the anxiety about whether I'd said the right thing, managed the impression correctly, maintained my position. I felt none of that. I just felt mild and even and ready to get home to my yellow house. Dorothy had soup waiting when I got there because I'd called her on the way, and she was Dorothy. We ate at her kitchen table and I told her about the grocery store. "How did it feel?" she asked. I thought about it. "Like running into someone I used to know," I said. "Someone I'd known pretty well, actually. But a long time ago." Dorothy refilled my bowl. "That's growth," she said. "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe it's just time." "With you," she said, "those are usually the same thing." Outside, the maples had gone bare, and the first real cold of winter was settling over Ohio. Inside, the soup was warm, and Walter, who'd followed me from the car, was asleep under the table with his chin on Dorothy's foot. I was 68 years old. I had lost a husband and, for a time, a son. I had given away more than I should have for longer than I should have, because I had loved someone without seeing clearly what I was loving. I had sat in my yellow kitchen on a March morning and read a message that should have broken me. It had not broken me. I had an orchid on my kitchen windowsill, a beagle with enormous ears, a watercolor of maple trees I'd painted myself, and a drawer full of Sundays I intended to spend exactly as I chose. I called it a good life. I called it mine. So that's the story. All of it. I learned this. The moment I stopped waiting for someone to tell me I was allowed to protect myself was the moment I actually could. What would you have done in my place? Leave me your thoughts in the comments. I read everyone. And if this story meant something to you, pass it on to someone who might need it. I'm grateful you listened this far. Take good care of yourselves. I never told my son about my $120,000 a month salary. He said, "Get out to a nursing home, beggar." "I'm tired of you!" His wife slammed the door. A week later, I bought the house across the street and opened the window. When he saw my face, "Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who sits at her own kitchen table feeling like a guest. But that's exactly what I had become. A guest in the house where I'd raised my son, paid the mortgage for 31 years, and repainted the front porch with my own 2 hands every spring without fail. My name is Margaret Caldwell. Most people called me Peggy. I was 68 years old, retired from a 24-year career as chief financial officer at a mid-sized logistics company in Atlanta, Georgia. I had a pension, a diversified investment portfolio, and a monthly income that most people my age would have found difficult to believe. $120,000 a month. I didn't say that to brag. I said it because it matters to this story, more than I ever expected it to. After my husband Gerald died 6 years ago, I made a decision that seemed natural at the time. Derek, my only son, suggested I sell my house in Buckhead and move in with him and his wife, Brianna, in their colonial revival on Sycamore Lane in Marietta. He said it made sense. He said he wanted me close. He said, and I remember the exact words, "Mom, you shouldn't be alone." I believed him. For the first year, things were tolerable. I had a bedroom on the second floor, access to the kitchen, and a routine that kept me busy. I gardened. I read. I video called my college friend Dorothy in Phoenix twice a week. I paid for groceries without being asked, quietly slipped money into household accounts when bills appeared on the counter, and never once mentioned how much I contributed. That was my nature. Gerald always said I was too private about money. Maybe he was right. The first signs came gradually, the way most dangerous things do. It started with Brianna. She was 40 years old, a real estate agent with the kind of smile that worked perfectly at open houses, and nowhere else. She had married Derek 11 years ago, and I had always treated her with respect, even when respect was difficult to manufacture. But somewhere around the 18-month mark of my living there, her behavior shifted in ways that were subtle enough to dismiss individually and impossible to ignore collectively. She began scheduling family dinners without telling me. I'd come downstairs to find Derek and Brianna and her parents seated at my late mother's dining table, the one I had brought from storage, eating a meal I hadn't been invited to join. When I appeared in the doorway, there'd be a brief silence, and then Brianna would say, brightly, "Oh, Peggy, there's food in the fridge if you're hungry," as though I were a boarder, as though I were someone who had wandered in from outside. Then came the comments about space. Brianna mentioned, once, twice, then with increasing frequency, that their son Tyler, who was 9, needed a proper study room. The implication was clear. My bedroom had a window seat and good afternoon light. Tyler currently did homework at the kitchen table. The geometry of the suggestion was not subtle. Derek said nothing. That was its own kind of message. I noticed how he looked at me at dinner. Not with hostility, not at first, just with a faint impatience, the way you look at a situation you're planning to resolve. I was 70 years his mother. I had nursed him through pneumonia at age 4, driven him to baseball practice 3 times a week for 6 years, paid his college tuition in full, and written him a check for the down payment on the Sycamore Lane house without a single condition attached. I was not a burden, but he had begun to see me as one. I didn't say anything. I watched. I waited. That had always been my way. Then came the Tuesday in March that I will never forget as long as I live. I had been in the backyard, pruning the rose bushes along the fence, when I heard them through the kitchen window. The window I'd told Brianna 3 times needed a new latch. The window she'd never had fixed. "She just sits here," Brianna was saying. "She doesn't contribute. She doesn't do anything." I set down my pruning shears. "I know," Derek said. And the terrible thing, the thing that stopped my breath, was not that he said it. It was how quickly he said it. No hesitation. No defense. As though he'd been thinking it for a long time and was only now finally free to say it out loud. That evening at dinner, I passed Derek the salt without being asked, the way I had done 10,000 times before. He took it without looking up. 2 weeks later, he sat down across from me at that same table, and the words he used were ones I had not prepared for, even though some part of me had seen them coming from a long way off. "Mom," he said, "I think it's time we talked about your living situation." I folded my hands in my lap. "All right," I said. "This isn't working for us." He paused. "Brianna and I feel like we need our space back. You'd be comfortable in one of those senior communities, the nice ones. They have activities and—" "You mean a nursing home?" I said. He looked uncomfortable. "That's not what I said." "No," I agreed. "That's what you meant." Brianna, who had been standing in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed, said nothing. But her eyes said everything. The quiet satisfaction of someone watching a plan reach its conclusion. "I'm not asking you to leave tomorrow," Derek said. But that was a lie, too. Because 3 days later, when I came downstairs with a cup of tea and asked whether we might discuss a timeline calmly, he pushed back from the table, his voice rising in a way I had never heard from him before, not even when he was a teenager, and said the words I will carry with me for the rest of my life. "Just go to a nursing home, you broke old woman. I'm tired of you." And Brianna, without a word, walked to the front door and slammed it so hard the picture frames shook on the wall. I stood in the hallway of the house I had helped purchase, holding a cup of tea that had gone cold, and said nothing. But I was already thinking. The tea went down the drain untouched. I went upstairs to my room, to the room that had been mine for nearly 3 years, and I sat on the edge of the bed, and I did what I had trained myself to do in every financial crisis, every boardroom ambush, every moment when the numbers stopped making sense and the people around the table started lying. I got quiet. I got very, very quiet, and I thought. The first thing I thought about was the practical reality of my position. I had no lease agreement. I had never signed anything establishing residency at 14 Sycamore Lane. In Georgia, after 30 days of continuous residence, a person acquires certain tenant rights. I knew that from years of working adjacent to real estate law through corporate contracts. But those rights were thin, and pursuing them against your own son in court was the kind of thing that destroys whatever remains of a relationship and takes 18 months and leaves everyone feeling hollow. I had no desire to fight Derek in a courtroom over a bedroom I no longer wanted to sleep in. What I had, and this was the second thing I thought about, was money. Not the way most people think about money, as a comfort or a cushion. I thought about it the way I had always thought about it, as information, as leverage, as the quiet architecture beneath every decision. $120,000 a month after taxes. My pension from 31 years in corporate finance. Dividend income from a portfolio Gerald and I had built carefully over 4 decades. A real estate investment trust that had been paying out reliably since 2009. Derek did not know about any of it. He had never asked about my finances, and I had never volunteered the information, because I had learned early in life that money changes people, and I had not wanted it to change the way my son looked at me. Well, it had changed things anyway. I sat with that irony for a moment. Then I let it go. Because irony doesn't solve problems. What hurt most was not the anger in his voice. I had heard angry voices before, in boardrooms, in depositions, from a CFO at a competing firm who once told me I was too cautious to ever be effective. I had survived all of it. What hurt was the casual certainty of his contempt. Broke old woman. He had said it the way you state an obvious fact, like the sky being blue. He believed it completely. That was the moment I understood the real shape of what had happened. It wasn't just cruelty. It was a mistake. Derek had made an enormous, fundamental, irreversible seeming mistake. He had made an enemy of the wrong woman without knowing who she was. And that, I realized, sitting on the edge of the bed in the afternoon light, was actually an advantage. I spent 2 days conducting what I privately called a damage assessment. I did not cry in front of anyone. I walked through the house calmly. I ate my meals at regular times. I slept adequately. I called Dorothy in Phoenix, and I told her, in broad strokes, what had happened. And Dorothy, who had known me for 43 years, said only, "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to handle it," I said. "You always do," she said. And then she laughed, and the laugh was warm enough that I felt something loosen slightly in my chest. On the 3rd day, I opened my laptop and I looked up property listings in Marietta, Georgia. Not because I had no options. I had many options. I could have bought a condominium on Peachtree in Buckhead, a beach house on St. Simon's Island, an apartment in any building I chose. I had the freedom to go anywhere. That freedom was real, and it was substantial. But I had also been thinking about something else. Something that had come to me that first night as I sat on the bed with the cold tea, and that had grown clearer over the 2 days since. The way a financial strategy grows clearer when you stop reacting to the crisis and start looking at the actual numbers. Sycamore Lane was a residential street in a quiet neighborhood. The house directly across from Derek and Brianna's was a 4-bedroom colonial, recently renovated, with a wide front porch and large front windows. It had been on the market for 11 days. I had noticed it on my morning walks for the past week without knowing why it interested me. Now I knew why. I was not going to disappear quietly into a senior community and let Derek and Brianna believe they had handled me. I was not going to leave and never be spoken of again. I was not going to become the cautionary tale of an old woman who was too proud and too stubborn to recognize when she was no longer wanted. What I was going to do was buy the house across the street, and I was going to do it before the end of the month. I picked up the phone and called my real estate attorney. The plan, at that stage, was simple. Purchase the property, move in, and let the geography do the work. Every morning when Derek left for the office, and every evening when Brianna came home from showing listings, they would see my car in the driveway across the street. They would see my lights on. They would know, with the particular discomfort that knowledge brings, that I had not gone away. But that was only the first layer. The second layer would take a little longer. I had 31 years of experience structuring deals that looked like one thing on the surface and were something else entirely underneath. I had never once entered a negotiation without knowing exactly what the final outcome would be 3 moves in advance. I was not starting now. I closed the laptop, made a list, and went to bed at 10 o'clock. For the first time in 2 weeks, I slept well. The first call I made on Monday morning was to my attorney, Ruth Landau, who had handled my corporate contracts for 19 years and who was, in my experience, the most competent and unsentimental person in any room she walked into. I asked her to meet me for coffee at a place I chose, not her office, not anywhere near Sycamore Lane. We met at a diner on Roswell Road. I ordered coffee and eggs. Ruth ordered only coffee and looked at me the way she always looked at people who were about to tell her something complicated. I told her everything. Not the emotional version. I had no interest in the emotional version in that moment, but the structural version, the timeline, the residency question, my lack of a written agreement, the verbal exchange with Derek, and my intention to purchase the property at 22 Sycamore Lane before the week was out. Ruth listened without interrupting. When I finished, she turned her coffee cup slowly on its saucer and said, Do you want me to talk you out of this? No, I said. Good, she said, because I don't see a reason to. You have the liquidity, the property is fairly priced, and you are not doing anything remotely illegal. You're buying a house. People buy houses. I need it done quietly, I said. Cash offer, no delays. Ruth nodded. I'll contact the listing agent this afternoon. The offer was accepted within 48 hours. $2,100,000, cash, no contingencies. The sellers, a couple relocating to Charlotte for work, were, according to the listing agent, thrilled with the speed. Ruth filed the paperwork. I signed everything from a conference room at Ruth's office building, not from Sycamore Lane. While this was happening, I was still living in Derek and Brianna's house. This was a deliberate choice. I had done nothing illegal, nothing that violated any social norm, and leaving in a panic would have communicated weakness. Instead, I moved through the house exactly as I always had. I made my coffee in the morning. I kept my door closed. I was polite when we crossed paths and gave nothing away. But I watched. And what I saw, beginning on the 4th day after our confrontation, was Derek making phone calls in the backyard with his voice lowered in a way it never was when he called clients or colleagues. I saw Brianna, twice, sit down at the kitchen table with her laptop and close it quickly when she heard me on the stairs. I noticed that the mail slot, which had always been left accessible, now had its inner flap closed, which was new. None of this was proof of anything yet. The proof came on a Thursday. I had an appointment with my financial advisor, Paul Ostroff, whose office was downtown. I drove to the appointment, conducted it, and returned home at midday, an hour and a half earlier than I had anticipated, because Paul's afternoon client had called ahead and our meeting had ended efficiently. I pulled into the driveway quietly. The garage door was closed. Brianna's car was gone. I assumed Derek was at work. I came through the side entrance, the one off the laundry room, which I used habitually because the front door lock had always stuck slightly in humidity. The house was quiet. I set my purse on the laundry room counter and walked toward the kitchen. And I heard Derek's voice. He was in the living room, on the phone, pacing the way he did when he was agitated. He had not heard me come in. The laundry room door was ajar. She doesn't have anything, Jim, he was saying. I'm telling you. She retired 6 years ago and she lives with us. She doesn't have a portfolio. I would know about it. She doesn't own property. A pause. No, I'm saying we wait another month. If she's still here, we can move forward with the other thing. The attorney said there are ways to establish. Yeah, exactly. Conservatorship, if it goes that direction. She's 68. She had one small health issue 2 years ago. I did not move. I stood in the laundry room with my hand flat on the counter, and I listened. Jim, I'm not saying she's incompetent. I'm saying it's an option if she doesn't cooperate. The attorney said, as long as there's documented. Yeah, I'll talk to Brianna tonight. He hung up. I stood there for 30 seconds. Then I walked back out the way I had come, as quietly as I had arrived. I sat in my car in the driveway with both hands on the steering wheel, and I breathed slowly for about 2 minutes. Conservatorship. The word moved through my mind like ice water. It was a legal process by which a court could appoint someone, in this case presumably Derek, to manage the financial and personal affairs of a person deemed unable to manage them independently. It was a tool designed to protect vulnerable people. It was also a tool that had been catastrophically misused by family members throughout legal history, and every financial professional I had ever known was aware of its potential for abuse. Derek was not trying to help me. Derek was trying to acquire control of whatever assets he believed I might have, and he was laying the groundwork carefully, patiently, with a lawyer's advice behind him. The small health issue he had referenced was a brief episode of atrial fibrillation 2 years ago, well managed and fully resolved, according to my cardiologist. It was the kind of thing that sounded alarming to a layperson and meant very little clinically. But in a conservatorship proceeding, it could be made to sound like something else. I was not afraid. I want to be clear about that. I was not afraid because I understood exactly what was happening, and I knew, with the certainty of someone who had spent 3 decades in financial strategy, that the only reason this plan had any possibility of working at all was because Derek believed I was what he had called me, a broke old woman. He did not know who I was. That was about to change. I drove to Ruth's office without calling ahead. She was between meetings. I sat down across from her desk and I told her what I had heard. Ruth's expression did not change. She picked up her pen. "Tell me everything he said, word for word." I told her. "All right," she said. "We move faster." I moved out of 14 Sycamore Lane on a Saturday morning. I had arranged it with the precision of a project I had managed at work. 2 movers I hired privately, a rental truck reserved under my name, and a moving window of 4 hours beginning at 8 in the morning. I had already transferred my essentials: documents, laptop, medication, the photograph of Gerald and me from our first year in Atlanta, to Ruth's office earlier in the week, in a bag I carried out as casually as if I were running an errand. What remained at Sycamore Lane was furniture, clothing, and books. It took 3.5 hours. Derek and Brianna were home. I had chosen the Saturday deliberately because I wanted them to see it. Not to provoke. I was not interested in theater. But because disappearing quietly in their absence would have given them a narrative they could control. This way, the narrative belonged to me. Derek came out of the front door when the truck arrived. He was wearing running clothes and holding a coffee mug. And when he saw the movers carrying boxes from the side entrance, something moved across his face that was not quite guilt and not quite surprise. It was the expression of someone whose plan is arriving ahead of schedule. "Mom," he said, "we can talk about this." "We don't need to talk," I said pleasantly. "I've found something that suits me better." Brianna appeared behind him in the doorway. Her eyes went to the movers, then to the truck, then to me. "Where are you going?" she asked. Her tone was careful, the tone of someone recalibrating. "Nearby," I said. I was civil throughout. I did not raise my voice. I did not inventory grievances or demand apologies. I thanked them, briefly and sincerely, for the use of the room, and I got into my car when the truck was loaded, and I drove it 300 feet down Sycamore Lane, turned into the driveway of number 22, and parked. I watched in my rearview mirror as Derek set down his coffee mug. The look on his face was worth considerably more than $2 million. The following days were busy in a way that felt good. The productive busyness of someone building something rather than defending against something. I worked with an interior designer I had used once before, a practical woman named Carol, who understood that I wanted the house functional and comfortable, not performative. Furniture arrived. The kitchen was stocked. I planted 3 rose bushes along the front fence on the second day, partly because I had always gardened, and partly because I knew Brianna would see them from her front window every morning. Then Derek came across the street. It was a Wednesday evening, 8 days after I had moved in. He knocked. I answered. He was alone, which surprised me slightly. I had expected Brianna's strategic presence. He stood on the porch with his hands in his jacket pockets and the particular expression of someone who has been rehearsing a conversation and has now forgotten his first line. "How did you afford this house?" he said. Not a greeting, not a preamble. "That's my business," I said. "Mom." He stepped forward slightly. "I need to know. There are things we've been looking into regarding your situation. your capacity to manage your own affairs. He paused to let that register. I don't want this to go anywhere unpleasant. There it was, not quite a threat. Exactly a threat. Are you telling me, I said, that you intend to pursue a conservatorship petition? The fact that I used the word conservatorship, the specific legal term, stopped him entirely. He had not expected that. He had expected confusion, or fear, or a woman who didn't know what the word meant. That's not what I said. Derek. I kept my voice even. I want you to listen carefully. I have a recording of your phone call from Thursday. I did not specify which Thursday. I did not specify whether the recording was legal or admissible. In Georgia, single-party consent governs, and I had been a party to no recording. What I had was notes, written immediately after the event, and Ruth's file. But he didn't know the difference in that moment. He went still. I also have an attorney who has already been briefed, I continued. Any petition related to my competency will be met with a complete financial disclosure that I suspect will surprise you. And it will be a matter of public record. I tilted my head. Do you want your colleagues to read about this in the Marietta Daily Journal? Brianna's voice came from across the street. Derek! He looked at me for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back across the street without speaking. I closed the front door, sat down on the bench in my hallway, and breathed. My hands were not shaking, which mildly surprised me. That weekend, Dorothy came from Phoenix to visit. She stayed for 4 days. We sat on the back porch in the evenings with glasses of sweet tea and talked about Gerald, about her grandchildren, about the garden I was planning for the south side of the yard. We watched 2 movies. We laughed several times at things that were genuinely funny. It was, I thought, exactly what I needed. Not escape. Restoration. On Sunday evening, after Dorothy's car had turned the corner at the end of the street, I stood on the front porch in the cool March air and looked at the lights on across the street. I felt completely steady. The call came on a Tuesday morning, 11 days after I had closed the door in Derek's face. It was Brianna. Her voice on the phone was warm in the way that only practiced voices can be warm, smooth and temperature-controlled, like an office building in August. Peggy, she said, I think we started off on the wrong foot. I was in the kitchen, reading. I set down my book and said, Good morning, Brianna. Derek and I have been talking. We feel terrible about how things ended. We were stressed with Tyler's school situation and the mortgage refinancing, and we said things that weren't fair. A pause. A careful pause. We miss you. I said nothing for a moment, which I knew would make her uncomfortable. There was actually something we wanted to propose, she continued, filling the silence with the efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this. Derek spoke with a financial advisor, just generally, about family estate planning. And the advisor mentioned that a family trust could be beneficial for everyone, a structure that would manage assets collectively and provide security for all of us, including you. Another pause. It would mean you'd never have to worry about managing things alone. There it was, dressed in new clothing, but the same architecture underneath. A family trust, if structured with Derek as trustee, would accomplish precisely what the conservatorship had been designed to accomplish. Control over financial decisions, framed now as generosity and family cohesion rather than legal compulsion. It was a more sophisticated approach, and I noted that with professional respect before rejecting it completely. I appreciate the thought, I said. I'll have my attorney review any proposal you put in writing. Silence. It doesn't need to be that formal, Brianna said, with a slight shift in tone that was the first honest thing she had communicated. Everything financial should be in writing, I said. That's always been my position. Send it to Ruth Landau's office and we'll take a look. I hung up. I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment, not because I was uncertain. I was not uncertain, but because I was aware of something. a kind of distance. I had loved my son for 42 years. I had been in this woman's life for 11 of them. And at this moment, I felt about them the way I felt about a complicated corporate account. Not with hatred, not with warmth, but with cool professional clarity. I would manage the situation. I would not be managed by it. They did not send anything to Ruth's office. What they did instead was watch. I noticed it over the next several days. The way Derek's car was sometimes in the driveway at odd hours, and the way the front room curtains at number 14 seemed to move when I came and went. Brianna drove past the house twice on a Thursday, in a route that had no obvious purpose. I logged it all in a small notebook I kept on my nightstand, not because I intended to use it immediately, but because documentation was a habit from decades in finance, and it had never failed me yet. Meanwhile, I was building something. I had joined, on Carol the designer's suggestion, a neighborhood association that met twice monthly at the community center on Johnson Ferry Road. I attended the first meeting in early April, expecting nothing in particular, and came away with something I had not anticipated. People. Real ones. There was a woman named Helen Marsh, 71, a retired school principal who had lived on the east side of Marietta for 30 years, and who spoke with the unadorned directness of someone who had spent a career managing other people's children and was done with diplomacy. There was a man named Robert Finch, 66, a former civil engineer who had designed 3 highway interchanges in the metro area and who brought homemade cornbread to every meeting without explanation or comment. There was Judith Park, 59, a family law attorney who had moved to the neighborhood after her own children left for college, and who, when I mentioned casually that I had been dealing with a family legal matter, handed me her card without making a production of it. Judith Park, family law. I put the card in my wallet and said I might be in touch. What I had been missing, I realized, in the 18 months I'd spent at Derek and Brianna's house, and perhaps in the 2 years before that, in the fog of early widowhood, was the company of people who saw me clearly. Not as someone's mother, not as a financial asset or a liability, just as Margaret Caldwell, who had opinions about drainage systems and school board elections and the particular injustice of the neighborhood association's parking policy. Helen Marsh invited me to walk with her on Wednesday mornings along the Rottenwood Creek Trail. I accepted. The first Wednesday, we walked 4 miles without stopping, and Helen told me about a property dispute with her neighbors that had lasted 6 years and ended in a negotiated settlement that she described with considerable satisfaction as a complete and total victory on every point. I laughed. It felt good in the chest. "You seem like someone with a plan," Helen said, glancing at me sideways. "I usually have one," I said. "Good," she said. "People without plans end up reacting to other people's plans." She shrugged. "I've seen it my whole career." I thought about that for the rest of the walk and for some time after. Derek and Brianna were still watching from across the street. Let them watch. I was no longer reacting. I was, in fact, nearly ready for the next step. They came on a Sunday. I had just returned from church, a habit I had resumed after Gerald's death and maintained unevenly, but which gave me something I could not quite name except as orientation, when I found Derek and Brianna on my front porch. Brianna was holding a bottle of wine and wearing the expression of someone performing sincerity for an audience. Derek stood slightly behind her, hands in his pockets, the way he had stood behind her for most of their marriage when the social work needed doing. "We should have called," Brianna said. "Yes," I agreed and opened the front door. "You should have. Come in." I did not offer the wine a place on the counter. I set it on the side table by the door and led them to the living room, where I sat in the armchair and gestured to the sofa. I did not get up to make coffee. Whoever was running this meeting, It was not going to be established by domestic hospitality. Brianna began. She was good at this, I had to admit. She led with regret. Not quite an apology, but something architecturally similar. She talked about stress and miscommunication and the genuine complexity of multi-generational households. She mentioned Tyler and how much he loved his grandmother, and how Derek regretted. Here she placed her hand briefly on Derek's knee, the tone of what he had said, if not the underlying concern. The tone, not the words, not the conservatorship, not Jim, whoever Jim was. What we really want, Brianna said, arriving at the destination she had been traveling toward since the front porch, is for you to reconsider this purchase. She gestured to indicate the house, the neighborhood, the geography of the whole situation. Living across the street, Peggy, it's not healthy for anyone. For you, for Tyler, for the relationship. A fresh start somewhere else would give everyone room to heal. I looked at her for a moment. A fresh start somewhere else? I repeated. We found some beautiful properties, she said, and reached into her bag and produced a printed sheet, actual paper, prepared in advance, with 3 listings circled. A condominium complex 20 minutes away in Smyrna, a senior living community in Kennesaw, a 1-bedroom apartment near Cumberland Mall. She had done her homework. She had printed the listings. She had driven to my house on a Sunday morning with wine and prepared materials and a practice speech. How long had they been planning this visit, I wondered. A week? 2? I understand, Derek said, speaking for the first time. His voice had shifted from the conversation on my porch weeks ago. Less confrontational, more conciliatory, in the way that people become conciliatory when the direct approach has failed. We may have handled things badly, but the situation as it stands, it's awkward for everyone. There's no reason to be neighbors, Mom. It doesn't make sense. It makes perfect sense to me, I said. A silence. Peggy. Brianna leaned forward slightly, and I saw the warmth recede and something more functional replace it. We've spoken with an attorney. I know, I said. She stopped. I know you've spoken with an attorney, I said. About a number of things. I suggest you speak with this one. I reached into the drawer of the side table. I had put the card there 2 days ago, in anticipation, and held out Judith Park's business card. She specializes in family law. She's also my neighbor, and she has already been briefed on the relevant history. Brianna took the card. She looked at it. Whatever she read there, the local address, the professional credentials, made her jaw tighten in a way she couldn't fully control. Derek stood up. This is absurd, he said, and the conciliation was entirely gone now, replaced by the bluntness I had heard through the kitchen window weeks ago. You're acting like we're your enemies. We're your family. You told me to go to a nursing home, I said calmly. You called me a broke old woman. You then began investigating legal mechanisms to take control of my affairs. I kept my voice level. I love you, Derek. You are my son. But you do not get to define what this family looks like now. He looked at me for a long moment. Something moved across his face. Something I could not fully read, and that might have been the beginning of something real. But Brianna touched his arm, and the moment passed. Fine, she said, and stood, and the wine was still on the side table. Fine. They left. The door did not slam this time, which was almost worse. A controlled exit is a different kind of statement than a slammed door. I sat in the armchair after they had gone, and I looked at the middle distance and I let myself feel what I was feeling, because I had found, over 68 years, that suppression is alone with compounding interest. What I felt was fear, not a large fear. Not the dizzying vertigo of someone whose ground is shifting, but a steady, ambient fear the kind that lives in the body, in the shoulders, in the jaw, and whispers that the worst may not have happened yet. They were not finished. Whatever Brianna had said to the attorney, whatever Jim was advising Derek, whatever the next step in their plan was, it was not over. I sat with the fear for 10 minutes, and then a strange thing happened, as it sometimes does with fear when you don't run from it. It changed. Not into courage exactly, but into something more useful. Clarity. And along with the clarity came something close to anger. Clean, directed, the kind of anger that doesn't cloud judgment, but sharpens it. I picked up the phone and called Ruth. "I think we're ready," I said. "I'll schedule the meeting," she said. Ruth scheduled it for a Thursday morning, 10 o'clock, at her office on Sandy Springs Circle. The meeting had been framed through Derek's attorney, a man named Mitchell Graves, whom Ruth had dealt with before, and described as technically competent but strategically overconfident, as a mediation session to resolve a family property dispute. This was accurate in the way that a weather forecast of partly cloudy is accurate before a hurricane. Derek and Brianna arrived with Mitchell Graves. He was a compact man in his early 50s, with the particular confidence of someone accustomed to being the most legally informed person in a room. He had a leather portfolio and a manner that suggested he had already written the settlement terms in his head. I arrived with Ruth and, seated already at the table, Judith Park, who had agreed to be present as a courtesy, as she put it, though we both understood her presence was a signal as much as a function. Derek and Brianna sat across from me. Mitchell took the chair beside Derek. The room was a conference room on the 3rd floor with large windows and no particular warmth to it. I preferred that. Mitchell opened. He laid out a position I had anticipated in most of its particulars, that my acquisition of the property at 22 Sycamore Lane represented a decision made under emotional distress, that there were questions, legitimate, he emphasized legitimate, regarding my capacity to manage major financial decisions independently, and that the family was prepared to support a care arrangement that would include professional financial management. He was careful with his language. He did not say conservatorship. He said supported decision-making structure. I let him finish. Ruth looked at me. I nodded slightly. "Thank you, Mitchell," Ruth said. "Before we go further, we'd like to submit some documentation for the record." She opened her own portfolio and passed a set of bound folders across the table. One to Mitchell, one placed in front of Derek. "These are Ms. Caldwell's financial records, current as of last Friday." Mitchell opened his folder. I watched Derek open his. I watched his face. The first page was a current account summary from my primary investment brokerage. The total figure at the top right was not hidden and was not ambiguous. I saw Derek's eyes find it and stop. "The second section," Ruth continued, "documents the cash purchase of 22 Sycamore Lane. Third section is a portfolio summary. The real estate investment trust, the pension disbursements, the dividend accounts." She paused. "You'll note the monthly income figure at the bottom of page 3. Mitchell had gone very still. He was reading with the concentration of someone who has just realized that the document in his hands is not the document he had prepared to respond to. 100 and Derek started and stopped. $120,000 per month, I said, after taxes. The room was quiet. "Ms. Caldwell," Mitchell said, recovering professionally, "these figures are verified by my accountant, my financial advisor, and 2 years of tax returns, all of which are included in the appendix," Ruth said. There is no question of accuracy. Brianna had not looked up from the folder in front of her. She was very still, and I thought, watching her, that whatever she had imagined about this meeting, this was not it. She had walked in, believing she understood the shape of the landscape. The landscape had turned out to be completely different, The conservatorship proposal, Judith said, speaking for the first time in her quiet, precise way, is without merit, and Ruth and I are prepared to contest it fully, publicly, and expensively if it is advanced. She looked at Mitchell. You know that, Mitchell. My clients were acting out of concern, Mitchell said. Your clients recorded a conversation, Ruth said. And this was the moment she deployed the detail I had given her from Derek's kitchen, in which Derek Caldwell discussed pursuing legal mechanisms to control his mother's assets. That conversation has been documented. If this proceeding advances, that documentation becomes part of the public record. He didn't, Derek started. I never said. You said conservatorship, I said. I was looking directly at him. You said, as long as there's documented, and you referenced my atrial fibrillation. You were on the phone with someone named Jim. I paused. I was in the laundry room. Derek's face did something I had not seen it do since he was a child. It collapsed. Not into anger, but into something raw, something exposed. Brianna put her hand on the table and then removed it, as if she had reached for something that wasn't there. We were worried about you, she said. Her voice had lost its professional warmth entirely. What was left was thinner, more real in a way, but far less controlled. You were alone, and we thought. You thought I was broke, I said, not cruelly, just precisely. And old and manageable. I looked at her steadily. You were wrong on all 3 counts. Mitchell closed his portfolio. He was already recalculating. I recognized the motion. I had seen it in boardrooms, in depositions, in every negotiation where one side discovers the other party's position is stronger than expected. I think we should take a short recess, he said. That won't be necessary, Ruth said. We have a proposal. Ruth's proposal had 3 parts. She had printed it, bound it, and slid it across the table before Mitchell could refocus. The first part was simple: immediate and written withdrawal of any conservatorship inquiry or supporting documentation, with a notarized letter confirming that no petition had been or would be filed, and that Mitchell Graves's firm had been engaged in connection with this matter. This was for the record. It established the history without ambiguity. The second part required Derek and Brianna to acknowledge, in writing, that the cash purchase of 22 Sycamore Lane was a valid transaction made by a competent adult with full legal and financial capacity. This was Ruth's elegant solution to the underlying legal risk. By signing, they were not simply dropping a claim. They were affirmatively destroying the foundation of any future claim of the same kind. Mitchell read it twice. He knew what it was. He had no good countermove. The third part was a modification to Gerald's estate, specifically a provision in the original will that had included a discretionary family trust that Derek and I had established together 4 years ago, and which had, until this week, named Derek as co-trustee. The modification, already drafted and awaiting a signature, removed Derek as co-trustee and replaced him with Ruth's firm in a fiduciary capacity. This was not punitive in legal terms. In practical terms, it was decisive. It removed Derek's future access to any jointly held asset I might have, preemptively and permanently. Mitchell read all 3 parts in silence. Then he looked at Derek. Derek had been looking at the table for most of the past 10 minutes. Now he looked at Mitchell, and I saw something in that exchange I had not expected. Derek did not look angry. He looked tired. He looked, in fact, like someone who has been running a race under false assumptions about the course and has just arrived, exhausted, at a fence he cannot cross. Mitchell, he said quietly, is there a way out of this that doesn't... Sign the documents, Mitchell said, in the flat voice of a man who has just decided to cut his losses. Or contest them. And I'll be billing you at $400 an hour for a proceeding you will not win. It was the most useful thing Mitchell had said all morning. Brianna spoke next, and I was prepared for a final maneuver. Some recalibration, some new strategy surfacing from beneath the wreckage of the current one. What I was not quite prepared for was the honesty of what she actually said. "We really thought you didn't have anything," she said. Her voice was flat now, almost wondering. "We genuinely, Derek asked you once, years ago, and you said you were comfortable, and we just assumed comfortable to someone older means something different. We assumed." I looked at her for a moment. "You assumed," I said. "And then, when I didn't behave the way a broke old woman was supposed to behave, when I bought a house, when I had an attorney, when I knew the word conservatorship, you didn't revise the assumption. You just escalated the plan." She had nothing to say to that. Derek signed first. He read each page carefully. I gave him credit for that. And then signed with the practiced motion of someone who has signed many documents in his life and is signing this one because the alternative is worse. His signature looked tired. Brianna signed second, her name, smaller than usual, pressed slightly hard into the paper. Ruth notarized everything on sight. Judith Park witnessed. The whole process took 14 minutes. When it was done, Mitchell gathered his materials and left without ceremony. That, too, I respected. He had walked in overconfident and was leaving in an orderly retreat, which was the professional response. Derek and Brianna stood to go. Brianna picked up her bag. Derek looked at me once. A long look, hard to interpret, somewhere between acknowledgement and grief, and then walked toward the door. "Derek," I said. He stopped. I had thought about this moment. Not theatrically. I had not planned a speech. But I had thought about what was true and whether there was anything true worth saying. And there was one thing. "I never hid my finances to deceive you," I said. "I kept them private because I didn't want money to be the thing between us. I wanted you to know me as your mother." I paused. "You chose to see me as something else. That was your decision." He was very still for a moment. Then he nodded once, a small, compressed nod, and went through the door. Brianna followed without looking back. Ruth and I sat in the conference room after they had gone. She poured water from the pitcher on the table and pushed a glass toward me. "How do you feel?" she asked. I thought about it genuinely. Not what I was supposed to feel, relief, triumph, righteous satisfaction, but what I actually felt. "Tired," I said, "and correct." Ruth smiled just slightly. "In my experience," she said, "that's the best possible combination." I drove home down Roswell Road with the windows down, even though it was a cool morning. I turned onto Sycamore Lane and into my own driveway, and I sat for a moment looking at the rose bushes along the front fence, which were just beginning to show their first small buds. Across the street, the house at number 14 was quiet. I got out of the car, went inside, and made coffee. Spring arrived properly in April, and with it, the kind of mornings I had forgotten were possible. Light coming in early through the east windows, coffee made at my own pace, nowhere to be unless I chose to be there. The south garden was planted. Lavender, coneflowers, 3 varieties of tomatoes along the back fence. I walked with Helen on Wednesday mornings. I had dinner with Judith Park and her husband once a week. I played bridge on Friday afternoons with a group that accepted me without ceremony. I was not performing happiness. That distinction matters. As for what was happening across the street, neighborhoods have a way of circulating information. Derek's firm entered a difficult period in the spring. A major 3-year contract was not renewed following a dispute over service terms. These were market forces. They had nothing to do with me. Brianna's real estate practice had also slowed. The Marietta market had cooled, Her listings ran longer, her margins thinner. The mortgage refinancing she had cited as a source of household stress had not gone as planned. None of this made me happy. I had no interest in their suffering. I had an interest in my own life, and my own life was very good. In June, I endowed a scholarship for first-generation college students, named in Gerald's memory. In July, my granddaughter Emma came to stay. 19, quiet, and exceptionally sharp. She helped me plant the fall bulbs, ate everything I cooked, and sat beside me on the back porch in the evenings, reading while I read, the two of us in the late summer light without needing to talk. On the last evening, she looked up from her book and said, "I like this house." "So do I said. "You seem settled." I thought about all that had happened since March. Since the kitchen window and the cold tea and the Tuesday that had broken something, and then, in its breaking, shown me something I had needed to see. "Yes," I said. "I think that's right." Looking back, I think the most important thing I learned from all of it was this. The people who believe you are powerless count on your silence to make it true. That was my lesson. What would you have done? If you had sat at that table and heard those words, if you had stood in a laundry room and understood what was being planned, would you have gone quietly? Would you have let the assumption stand? I hope not. If this story meant something to you, I'd be glad to know it. Leave a comment. Tell me what you thought. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this one, about women who were underestimated and what happened next, consider subscribing. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. It meant more than you know.